know it's hot. It's damn hot. But we're all here for a good thing, so thank you all for being here. And we heard from Alan about some of the failures of the populists of the past and why they failed, and also why there's good reason for hope. We heard from Joseph Jordan about courage, honor, struggle, all the best things that we need to continue this movement. So what is the main thing that's holding us back right now? The main competitor for the attention of white people in America? It's the Republican Party. So let's talk about that for a little bit. So in the last couple of months we've seen the Republican Party has seemed to show a little backbone. They've opened up a bit of a struggle against gender ideology, against transgender, turning boys into girls and things like that. The nature of this resistance has been mainly seemingly built to fail measures that they have put forward to ban men from women's sports. I mean it's absurd. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, but that's where we are. That's where we are. So it seems like these laws are more likely intended to fail, which ultimately will demoralize opponents of gender ideology and entrench the idea that this is an unstoppable political force, even though most people are against it. It seems more geared towards demoralizing us ultimately than towards actually standing up against these people. This came into sharp relief when the Arkansas governor, Asa Hutchinson, vetoed a wildly popular bill that would ban what is effectively genital mutilation and chemical castration of children. His defense of this move was to meekly appeal to the Republican Party's governing philosophy: limited government. The government, according to Hutchinson, has no right to interfere in the so-called medical choices of individuals. In a similar case, South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who is probably going to be a contender for president for the GOP nomination in 2024, vetoed a bill to ban men from women's sports on the grounds that it was overly broad. I mean, we can do a lot of puns with that, but, And her other argument was the liberals are just you're gonna beat it in the courts anyway if we do this, so why bother, right? Both of these cases reveal the lie of the idea of limited government for what it is. Limited government is not a governing philosophy. It's not a political philosophy. It's an anti-political philosophy. It's an excuse to not ever do anything. And on top of that, these Republicans don't even really believe in it. And I'll give you some examples. Where was Governor Hutchinson? Where was his idea of limited government when in 2019 he signed legislation requiring people that are going to be contractors with the state of Arkansas to sign an oath that they will not boycott the state of Israel? Effectively a loyalty oath to a foreign nation. So the law was actually overturned in February by the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals because it violates the First Amendment. But the Attorney General of Arkansas, who was appointed by Hutchinson, had said, we're going to keep fighting. We're going to keep fighting. We're not giving up. So we're going to keep fighting, and they decided they're going to either appeal to the Supreme Court, or they're going to write a new law that just won't have slightly different language, so it can't get caught in the same decision again. So where's the idea that we have to just scrap laws because we have to not even try because the courts are going to overturn it anyway? Suddenly that's out the window, right? Suddenly that's gone. No, that concern, that deep concern of Kristi Noem seems not to apply in this case. All of these limited government conservatives suddenly were very, very much like rabid liberals pushing for their kinds of legislation, using lawfare, using the courts, doing things to undermine the popular will. You think that conservatives are incapable of doing that kind of thing. That they don't ever do the kind of lawfare, the kind of unprincipled tactics in the courts that liberals do, but they're perfectly capable of doing it. Just not for what you want. Just not for what you want. They're totally capable of doing it for what their Jewish donors want. It's almost like there's a common factor between laws that say you can't boycott the state of Israel, laws that say you can't discriminate against homosexuals, and laws that push for things like white privilege training in schools, or that you have to accept it because it's free speech, right? So again, we have another example here. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, another limited government conservative. He's probably also another guy that's going to compete for the nomination in 2024. He likes to talk about his credentials of being a limited government conservative because he reopened his state after, just only 1 year of economically devastating coronavirus restrictions. Thank you. Very limited. Restrictions for which he offered no monetary compensation to his citizens. What little compensation was offered to citizens, so-called citizens, of the state of Texas was actually targeted mainly at non-whites and, of course, at illegal immigrants. No doubt economic relief for whites would be strenuously opposed by Governor Abbott under the aegis of limited government. Even worse, the day after he announced this reopening, Abbott appeared in a press conference sitting in front of the flag of the Jewish nation, announcing that he had signed the resolution condemning online free speech platform Gab because it goes against Texas values. So apparently the idea of limited government does not prohibit a conservative governor from sitting in front of the flag of a foreign state and condemning the First Amendment. That's a philosophy of limited government for you, right? So it's news to me, actually, that free speech wasn't a Texas value. I don't know. I've had the exact opposite impression basically my whole life. I don't know where I got that impression. So I wonder if we were to look at a geographical distribution of people that are regular users of Gab, where do you think Texas would rank on that distribution? I'm guessing pretty high. And so who in Texas, who's beating down Abbott's door to condemn Gab? A site that frankly has a better claim to representing Texas values than he does. So I think we know the answer. It's the same people that want to say you're not allowed to boycott Israel. It's the same people promoting transgender ideology. It's the same people that are demanding that schools and universities teach anti-white abuse, which they call anti-racist training. It's really just abuse of white people. So this ideology of limited government has been incredibly damaging to white interests and to traditional American values. So make no mistake, limited government is not the same as freedom. It is not the same thing as freedom. Republicans, conservatives, hucksters like Hutchinson, Abbott, Noem, and Donald Trump would love you to believe that's the case. They would love you to believe that's the case, but it's not. Let me give you an example. Censorship of online discourse is the biggest threat to the First Amendment in this country going on right now. It's being done by private corporations. They are far more limiting to people's speech rights than the government is today. Yet the policy of allowing these corporate giants to step all over the rights of the people is allowed under the aegis of limited government. We can't do anything. Your rights are being totally crushed by corporations, but Republicans won't do anything because our philosophy is not to interfere. Not to interfere, right? Who are we to infringe on the rights of private company? Who are we to require multi-billion-dollar corporations that enjoy monopoly powers, massive government protection and subsidy? Who are we to interfere in them stepping all over the rights of the people? We can't do it. Limited government forbids that we get involved. This would be so easy to fix. A simple law that requires corporations over a certain size have to respect the First Amendment the same way the government does. Very simple, plain language, it would fix it. it would also be wildly popular with the people of this country. You could easily get 80, 90% of people on board for such a law, but nobody will do it. We'll do it. When it comes to jobs, when it comes to employment. One of the major reasons that people self-censor in this country is they're afraid of losing their livelihood. They're afraid of these so-called woke mobs, as they call them, really just anti-white lunatics. And they're actually a very tiny percentage of people, very tiny percentage of people that are neoliberal activists on the internet, rabid. A simple law forbidding employer retaliation against citizens for things that they say online or in public or anywhere, political or not political, as long as they're legal statements. Simple law. You can't fire your workers for things that they say. It would protect freedom. It wouldn't be an infringement on freedom. More people would be protected than would have all their rights infringed. But the conservatives won't do it. Democrats won't do it because of limited government. We can't do it. We can't interfere in the supposed rights of these giant concerns. But again, it's a thing that will be wildly popular with the people. But here's the question. Why should anybody respect a political philosophy that generates these kind of outcomes? There's no reason. There's no reason. Even worse. There are times when limited government is a valid thing to talk about. There are times when it could prove very useful in protecting the rights of people when they are up against actual government overreach, actual government oppression. In these cases, these political hypocrites are nowhere to be found. Speaking of Arkansas again, Asa Hutchinson, where's his limited government ideology when it comes to defending one of his very own citizens who is right now being abused in federal jail? Arkansas resident Richard Big O Barnett. I think we all remember him. He was the hero. The hero of January 6th who dared to stomp his working man's boots upon the desk of holy Nancy Pelosi. Right now, he is suffering racially motivated abuse in federal jail. According to court testimony published by Politico, Barnett was the victim of an anti-white beating by prison staff in which he was beaten while the guards screamed, "I hate all white people." Another inmate in the same jail with Barnett suffered a beating in which he had a fractured skull, went blind in one eye, and has a detached retina. Where is Asa Hutchinson to condemn this? Where is any conservative? Where's Donald Trump? You're not hearing a word out of any of these people. None of these people are saying anything. And then, limited government? I thought the government wasn't supposed to abuse people. I thought it wasn't supposed to overreach its limits. But see, suddenly they don't want to be anywhere near it. And it's not like these people are shy when it comes to, criticizing the criminal justice system in America. Of course not. Hutchinson, Noam, Abbott, Donald Trump, just like all conservatives, lined up to support Black Lives Matter, uncritically parroted the assertion that America has a huge problem with so-called white supremacy and that blacks and other minorities are suffering under the white boot. They've all followed the lead of Donald Trump. Conservatives are all following the lead of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the one who started this trend, saying that police are inherently racist and policing must be reformed so that fewer black criminals go to jail. This was his idea. Remember that. At the same time, they've also all said that they vehemently oppose so-called white supremacy and they're dedicating even greater police resources to fighting it. But what about limited government? In terms of using police resources to fight so-called white supremacy, there's actually a very good argument for it. When I spoke in January, I talked about the absurdity of the 2019 ADL white extremism report. in which they claimed there was 38 deaths linked to so-called right-wing white supremacist extremism in a year when there was a total of 16,425 murders. I predicted then that when we got the numbers for 2020, they would be even worse, and boy was I right. The same report that the ADL releases every year, their extremist violence report, found only 16 deaths in America that could be linked to so-called right-wing extremism. These were not even murders or terror attacks. They're simply deaths that could be somehow loosely linked to individuals that they say have right-wing extremist beliefs. Meanwhile, the number of murders in the United States spiked to over 19,000, a rise of over 15% in a single year. Unprecedented in American history, a rise like that. We all know why it's risen. So you would think that a proponent of limited government would take these stats and argue that all state resources dedicated to fighting against white supremacist terrorism should be cut or maybe dedicated to something else, like actually fighting black crime. But the GOP is doing just the opposite. They're doing just the opposite. But let me repeat this just so you can actually grasp it. If we're to take seriously the ADL's 2020 report, if we're to take the ADL seriously at all, there's not really a reason to, but hear me out. Hear me out. The ADL is the foremost expert in white supremacist extremism, right? They're the experts in this. They do the report every year. They know everything about it. Yet, according to their own report, white supremacist extremism statistically doesn't even exist. 16 out of 19,000 is such a tiny blip, it effectively, for the purpose of statistics, does not exist. It's effectively zero. So the problem that the ADL talks about, the problem that the media talks about, the problem that conservative politicians talk about, does not exist. So every single conservative is a big government interventionist, willing to step all over the rights of the people, willing to step on the First Amendment, willing to step on the Second Amendment, willing to see people beaten and abused in jail for a problem that doesn't even exist. But suddenly their limited government bona fides come out again when we talk about black crime, which is currently spiking off the charts in this country, with tragic results, as we heard from Joseph's speech earlier, which was just only the most recent tragedy in, I can think of, frankly, since the tragedy in Atlanta, I can think of 8 having nothing to do with white people.
2 weeks.
Yeah, and it's like 8 mass shootings. It's unbelievable. It is unbelievable, actually. It is shocking.
Yeah.
This cancerous concept of limited government is not only used to punt the football on social issues, it's trotted out as an excuse to oppose spending on infrastructure, on health care, or on increases to wages. Occasionally, liberals will bring it out too if there aren't enough conservatives to obstruct them. They need to do some song and dance to find a reason to obstruct themselves, just like Donald Trump and Paul Ryan did from 2016 to 2018. Now we've got Joe Manchin. Exactly right. So limited government has been the constant refrain of conservative politicians who have refused for years to fund improvements and upgrade to our crumbling infrastructure, citing the extremely lame excuse that we'd have to raise taxes and that would cost us jobs. That's their line. People that say that are just liars, right? They're pretending that we are too stupid to understand that this government is funded by debt, not taxes. They want us to be that stupid. They're not that stupid. They pretend like they are, but they're not. Some of them might be, actually. In reality, the national debt is just a piggy bank for the rich. It's a piggy bank for the rich and the powerful who feel free to tap it for billions in bailouts, loan guarantees, subsidies, benefits that they simply don't want to share with the rest of us. To do so would be fiscally irresponsible. And I mean, look, there's one thing we wouldn't want to be, right? We would have to be fiscally irresponsible. I mean, God forbid. God knows. What a terrible fate that would be, right? All fake concerns of politicians about fiscal responsibility are going to go out the window when it comes to funding a massive military apparatus that only benefits the state of Israel, trillions for wars that only benefit the state of Israel, billions in direct aid to Israel, and yet more billions to bribe Arab countries to betray their Palestinian brothers. All these are legitimate functions of government, according to Republicans. But funding the things that we actually need, the people of America actually need and want, that's not a legitimate function of government. The legacy of years of refusal of them to improve our country, to fund infrastructure, liberals and conservatives alike have done that, results in the decaying and crumbling country we see outside every day. And the Biden administration is not offering anything that's going to solve this problem either. Right now, at the top of the stack for the Biden administration is a big infrastructure bill they're planning on putting into action sometime later in the year. But it's not really about infrastructure if you take a look under the hood here. It's actually an ideologically anti-white bill whose main goal, according to them, is to advance racial equity and bridge gaps in economic outcomes. That is actually their goal number one with this. So under the guise of funding infrastructure, which everybody in America wants, they want improvements to our roads, to our bridges, and they want the jobs and the economic development that will go along with that. Under the guise of that, they're simply working on a bill that's going to ideologically, from the beginning, exclude white workers. That is their goal. That's what they want to do. No more. But you wouldn't know that from listening to Republicans. They're only opposing this bill on the grounds that it will increase the marginal tax rate. Right? They're not opposing it because it literally makes racial discrimination against whites one of its top priorities. Which, if they were to do that, suddenly they would find that they were kind of popular again. Yeah, they could actually win elections by doing that, by telling America, the Democrats are out here discriminating against white people, just like Donald Trump did in 2016, kind of. But they would be wildly popular overnight for doing it, but they're not going to. They're not going to. And of course, all they have to do, all the Biden administration has to do is dog and pony show of negotiations. Oh, we remove that marginal tax rate increase, boom, they're all going to vote for it. But instead of quibbling about that, why not just attack it for being anti-white? Because it's not in the script for Republicans.
NJP! 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 NJP!
Republicans' job is not to appeal to white interests. It is to confuse and misdirect white Americans and confuse them as to what their interests really are. That's their job. That's what they do. And meanwhile, our country continues to fall apart. A recent report by the American Society of Civil Engineers gave the U.S. a C- for infrastructure relative to other developed countries. The report found that there's a water main break every 2 minutes in America. 43% of our roads are in poor or mediocre condition. 42% of bridges are at least 50 years old. 7.5% of bridges in America are on the verge of collapse. And 178 million trips are taken by Americans every day across structurally deficient bridges. This is in the supposed richest and most powerful first world country in the world. We saw, yeah, it really is a shithole. Look at Florida just last week, where we had a contaminated water reservoir breach that could have risked massive flooding into local communities of contaminated water. So these kind of catastrophic infrastructure failures are happening every day, and it's going to get worse as the economic and, frankly, the demographic situation continues to decline. Yet we can't do anything about it because limited government. Can't do it. Liberals will pull this out too, so we saw the dog and pony show with Joe Manchin refusing to vote for federal $15 minimum wage. The senator for West Virginia, one of the whitest and most working class states in our country, where the people could all greatly benefit from that raise, he was the one that put up the stiffest fight against it. It's not an accident.
White strike! 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 White strike!
philosophy of limited government? Where did it come from? Who is it that actually supports this ideology? Contrary to the assertions of conservatives, it is not a traditionally American point of view. Not at all. In fact, you can't really find it if you go back further than the 1960s, when figures like Barry Goldwater and frankly, the CIA operative William F. Buckley made their appearance on the political scene. Buckley's job was to reform the conservative movement by purging it of any remaining vestiges of anti-Semitism, pro-white racial sentiment, opposition to the Civil Rights Act, opposition to immigration, and opposition to neoliberalism. Oh man, it's really hot in here. All right. Oh, we're working through it. To this end, Buckley focused single-mindedly on the philosophy of limited government. He purged figures such as Joe Sobran and Peter Brimlow from the ranks of National Review, and he set the stage for neoconservative Jews to control the entire discourse in the American right. The new conservative program consisted of support for tax cuts, the deregulation of big business, increased military budgets, support for legal immigration, opposition to white racialism, and a fanatical devotion to Zionism. Buckley further argued for dropping all political opposition to liberal social movements, suggesting instead that conservatives just go to church. Just go to church. Just go to church. According to Buckleyite conservatism, fighting for your values is the worst thing you can do. Fighting for your values is the worst thing you can do according to them. It's bad when the left does it, so we shouldn't do it either, is the refrain of endless, nauseating National Review column inches. Endlessly. How many times have we read that refrain over and over and over? They're still doing it. David Frenchism, anybody sound familiar to anybody? So this ideology by the 1980s under President Reagan had become the defining ideology of the entire American right. It had taken over all discourse. But when you think of how ridiculous and alien it is, there's an anecdote I want to tell you. So years ago I found an old interview between William F. Buckley and Enoch Powell, British politician famous for the Rivers of Blood speech warning about non-white immigration into Britain. So during this debate, Buckley took up a position that was effectively indistinguishable from the most insane left-wing open borders fanatic of today. Throughout the conversation, Buckley insinuated that Powell was morally reprehensible for even valuing the concept of race, arguing that he ought to instead view people as economic units that can be ranked purely according to how useful they are to capitalism. After the debate, the audience was allowed to ask some questions of Powell. The first questioner wasn't interested in immigration. It's a Buckleyite conservative that stood up to ask the first question. He says, Mr. Powell, I want to talk to you for a second about the number of eyeglasses and dental fillings provided to British citizens by the National Health Service. Do you think that's the proper role of government? I mean, they just had a conversation about the future of the West, the future of Great Britain, the possibilities of change because of non-white immigration. And here this conservative comes up, he's talking about dental fillings and eyeglasses. And Enoch Powell, frankly, he was thunderstruck by the sheer inanity of this question, the sheer ridiculousness of the question. And this is who these people are. But this was Buckley's job. His job was to purge the conservative movement of people like Powell in favor of people that will uncritically parrot the new program of limited government, free market capitalism, colorblind liberalism, and rabid Zionism. So who supports this idea? Well, not very many people, as it turns out. Not very many people at all. In fact, it's likely that white nationalism is already significantly more popular than limited government conservatism. The 2018 report Hidden Tribes, which is put out by political scientist Stephen Hawkins and a team of researchers found that only 6% of Americans, a group that Hawkins and his staff referred to as dedicated conservatives, people that actually believe in limited government, it's only 6%, the smallest group out of the 7 main groups that they identified in their study. Now, the second largest group were people they called traditional conservatives at about 19%. These are people who have traditional social values but don't much care about limited government. And then the largest group was something they called the politically disengaged. About 25% of people are the politically disengaged. All of these groups, all 3 of these groups are overwhelmingly white. Amongst the 3, the dedicated conservatives are the wealthiest and the most politically engaged. They make up the staffers, interns, and activists of the GOP. Traditional conservatives and the politically disengaged are less interested in limited government, but still support traditional social values. The politically disengaged, it's a very interesting group. The politically disengaged are more opposed to immigration than any other group, more likely to favor hard measures to shut down the border, and more likely to say that being white is an important part of their identity. So, dedicated conservatism is really just as status conscious of an ideology as is extreme liberalism. In fact, there's really not very much disagreement between the two of them if you think about it. Some big brain centrist commentators have said, you know, if you dedicated conservatives, and you kind of like extremist liberals, like the sorts of people that promote Antifa and stuff like that, if you would just stop yelling fascist at each other and sit down, you'd find that you agree on almost everything. I mean, these big brains are absolutely correct. Liberal extremists are really not all that opposed to capitalism, particularly not when it's used to attack white people and promote homosexuality. Right. And dedicated conservatives are not really all that opposed to liberal social values, just as long as it's based on individual choice and promoted by capitalism rather than government. These ideologies are both tailor-made for the upper middle class. They offer members of this class a veneer of social respectability contingent on their continued repetition of politically safe talking points. In this way, Jews exploit the vanity, social anxiety, and materialism of these people and turn them into useful political operatives in favor of Zionist hegemony. Each can be counted on to stymie efforts of their respective bases for progressive economic reform and conservative social reform. This system has left a large group of people in America feeling disenfranchised and politically alienated.
AJP!
Yes! The cynical con man, Donald Trump, took advantage of this situation and ran a campaign in 2016 appealing directly to traditional conservatives and the politically disengaged, while specifically avoiding any mention of limited government. And it was wildly successful. He won. But once in office, Trump instead governed exactly like a dedicated conservative, with the exception of policy towards Israel, where he has happened to be a big government interventionist. And what was the result? He lost. So bear with me, this is the last statistic, I promise. Another 2018 study by political scientist George Hawley found that 12% of people agree with the alt-right, what was called at the time the alt-right. White identity politics. His study found roughly 12% of people in America agree with that. Now, under pressure... from Jews, Hawley had to revise this statement, but the underlying data was the same. He just offered a more restrictive definition of what it really meant to agree with the alt-right. But it was really nothing changed about the data. So already we can safely say that our ideas are twice as popular as any conservative Republican you see on TV. incredibly heartening to us. Millions of people are already out there and want to hear our message. Yeah! This is why we are targeted. This is why we're targeted by the FBI for political terror. This is why we're targeted by corporate America for censorship. But this is why we can win. Yeah! This is why there is no need to make any compromise with dedicated conservatives who don't need to incorporate their ideas into ours. We don't need them. They're the ones that need to run the political con game, not us. We don't need to despair that there's no hope for a third position in America. There are millions of people all over the country that agree with our vision of traditional social values and progressive economic reform.
Yes!
There are people all over this country that agree that we must retain a white majority in perpetuity and that the state has the moral right to take strong action to defend the majority. There are millions of people all over this country sick of censorship, sick of woke capitalism, sick of anti-white indoctrination. There are millions of people all over this country sick of eternal Zionist wars, foreign conflicts that are not in their interests and that they don't even understand. We need to seek out these potential comrades and tell them that they do not need to be helpless pawns of a rapacious elite. They do not need to suffer the indignities and insults day in and day out from a media and a political class that hates them. We need to tell our white brothers and sisters that they deserve and they can have a society where the state stands up and fights for them. It's not impossible. The first step is to jettison the Republican Party and take our political destiny into our own hands. It's time to fundamentally reject all those politicians that tell us the state should simply be a passive guardian whose job is simply to stand idly by and preserve the system by which people can peacefully dupe each other out of money. After 70 years, where has this ideology gotten us? Despite all their appeals to freedom and limited government, the chains of the oppressor grow heavier around our neck year after year, and our politicians pretend like they don't even exist. Enough! An old friend of ours once said, "The state is a weapon in the life struggle. It's a sword in the hand of the people in the struggle for existence. Conservatives want us to put down that sword. They actually don't even want us to beat it into a plowshare. They just want us to throw it away. But together, we can fight to take it back and use it in the defense of our people." So this is why we're here today. This is what the National Justice Party is for. Thank you all very much for being here.